Thank you. Thanks again for the opportunity to speak today. I really appreciate it. So just a quick slide about revolutionary security. We partner with cybersecurity stakeholders in critical infrastructure environments to develop and execute a proactive defense program that addresses the cyber landscape of today and the advanced threats of tomorrow. As you can see, we focus on some core areas: assessments and test, security program transformation, strategic consulting, SOC services, design, build, and staff, SOC services, and secure architecture. We provide these services across a variety of IT and OT industries, including energy, oil and natural gas, utility space, manufacturing, retail, and service providers, both domestic and worldwide. Our core leadership team in the OT security practice includes Rich Mahler, President and CEO, Jim Pruitt, Vice President Services, Jeff Muka, Vice President Strategic Development, and my boss, Jason Holcomb, who I think you guys are most familiar with due to previous presentations. And we'll go ahead and get started on this. As you can see, timing can be almost everything. This is going to be a non-attributed case study. We won't discuss the client that we worked with on this, but wanted to provide a bit of an overview of the engagement, what we were working with the client on, and then what happened. All right, so it was a pretty typical engagement, prepping for OT transformation with the client. They wanted to develop a cybersecurity program pretty much from the ground up. It's a mid-sized business working on improving their security posture. We were slated to work with them for discovery of internal processes and procedures, looking at a variety of assessments and activities to measure risk and deploy appropriate controls. Things were moving forward without any issues. Plans were being developed until one Sunday evening. We got a harried call from the client. As you know, Sunday evening calls are never, typically never a good thing. The client called to report that a ransomware infection had begun spreading within the company. Many of their machines were locked out. They needed help as soon as possible, and we were on our way into a full-blown cybersecurity incident to help identify, contain, eradicate, and recover the environment. It's not the best way to find out how prepared a client is for a cybersecurity attack, but attackers never choose a convenient time for a victim. As you can tell, with the client engaging to build out their cybersecurity posture, there were some gaps in coverage that we were helping to address, and this was turned into a firefight pretty quickly with the client. So just a quick timeline for detection to response. At about minus 35 days, they had the earliest detection of attacker activity. They did not find out about the attacker activity at that point, but that's the earliest that they could trace back the access that the attacker used in order to start perpetrating the attack. Between minus 5 days and minus 1 day, the attacker performed various discovery activities, utilizing both built-in tools and tools that they downloaded through remote access to the systems. They were able to establish persistent remote access and began staging their malware. And they had actually, in addition to the built-in tools, had actually used a third-party service in order to establish that persistence so they could log in and interact with the systems at any point, basically as though they were sitting there in front of the system. The account that they actually compromised was an administrator level account. So once they established access into the environment, they were pretty much limitless with what they could do in the environment. At minus 1 day, client victimized by ransomware attacks on their server infrastructure. Workstations were not included in this, but their server infrastructure was the key for them as far as their environment. So on the 0 day, that's when the client started to get notifications from staff that various systems were unavailable, Exchange was not available, file servers are not available. Received notification, began checking, and saw the ransomware screen that we're all pretty familiar with at this point, demanding that they provide payment to a anonymized Bitcoin wallet in order to gain their access to their systems back. It was at that day, day 0, that the client contacted Revolutionary Security to find out what we could do. The next day, plus 1 day, Revolutionary Security arrived on site to begin the IR activities.
Hey Daryl, quick question, point of clarification, a question that came in. Did you mention what the industry or segment this client was in? And I don't know if that's something you can divulge.
I did not mention that. I would rather not mention at this point. They are involved in energy services.
Energy
I
services?
think is the
Okay.
best that I can provide at this point.
I think that's ambiguous enough. Thanks for that.
Yeah. Yeah, it's actually still, you know, the timeline, we went ahead and stopped the timeline at the plus 1 day when we became involved with the client for the incident response activities. It's ongoing at this point still. So providing any additional information at this point would probably not be a good idea, but we are doing a variety of activities with the client to both continue to investigate what had occurred and remediate security issues as a result of this.
So Daryl, we've got another question online. What happens when the backup's being restored may have a virus that was dormant when they're restored? Are you back to square one, or how do you handle situations like that?
Definitely. One of the keys that we'll talk about later on centers around backups. If your backups are online at the time that ransomware takes hold, there's a very good chance that your backups, both the systems that you're backing up as well as the backups themselves, may be encrypted or compromised. So offline backups are key to avoiding serious non-recoverable issues with ransomware attacks. If your backups are offline, truly offline and inaccessible to the network, then you stand a much better chance of recovering your systems via backup methods. And that'll depend on, of course, your schedule for backups, your retention, things of that nature. But an offline backup is by far your best chance of avoiding having to pay the ransomware to get your files back.
Thank you.
Yep. Okay. The attacker's tactics, techniques, and procedures. These are things that we noticed about the attackers. We were investigating the incidents. Initial access was gained. Their discovery techniques were low and slow to avoid detection. Again, they utilized a lot of tools that were already installed on the systems, regular administrative tools. Since they compromised an account that already had admin access, they didn't have to rely on privilege escalation or cracking passwords online, things that would typically tip their hand that the attacker is active in the environment. Using the admin level access, the attackers were able to establish a persistent connection, again, using built-in admin tools to discover additional systems, to make unauthorized changes to systems, including disabling security controls. They were able to get in and actually disable the anti-malware protection on the servers to avoid detection of their attack. And once the anti-malware protection was disabled, they were able to download their ransomware launcher and begin execution of the ransomware on various servers. The attackers invested a significant time exploring the victim network and planned the attack with information gained during the discovery effort. This was not necessarily a targeted attack against the client. However, it had a lot of the hallmarks of that, the approach that the attackers used, the low and slow approach they took, and their targets. It seemed like they had a lot of information about the system. They were able to gain that through access, and they definitely developed a plan of attack. This wasn't just a kind of a set and spray attack against a system hoping that it took root. This is something that they actually invested targeted time against this particular client in order to attack their systems. It was also a little different that they focused purely on server infrastructure, did not encrypt any of the workstations. One of the more common ICS or OT ransomware attacks right now is Snake or ECANs, depending on how you, which source you're reading. It's a ransomware attack that is definitely targeted against ICS systems that will actually detect the system that's being used and encrypt various configuration files such that the systems themselves remain operational. However, all of your industry specific, your HMI configurations, your historians, those types of systems have all of their system files encrypted such that the application no longer runs. So much more targeted, much less likely to trigger events, but nonetheless, by attacking workstations and servers in those environments requires a lot more recovery time. And that's another key to the backups is really selecting your targets well and identifying the systems, whether workstations, if there's something that can easily be recovered, that may be a lower priority in your backup schedule than what you might do with servers that will affect a lot more larger audience and potentially take a lot more time to recover and reconfigure. So, okay. So key takeaways, early detection is a must. The earlier you detect a security incident, the better your chances for containment. This is also known as dwell time for attackers. So in the incidents that we're talking about today, dwell time was approximately 35 days. That's the amount of time that the attacker has access to your system before they're detected and can do discovery, plan their attack, stage everything, right up until the big bang when they hit the go button and the bad stuff that we see starts to occur. Another key takeaway, establish and exercise your incident response plan. By proactively practicing your plan, you'll identify gaps in the plan. This is particularly important for recovery activities, making sure you know where your system documentation is, making sure you've got offline copies of your recovery plans and your incident response plans in the event that your system is not accessible. And knowing who your team members are, keeping that up to date. An incident response plan, unfortunately for some entities, is something that a lot of time is spent developing, but they don't spend time practicing it or updating it. So an IR plan document is definitely a living process that has to be cared and maintained. Have a plan in place to reach out for assistance. This could be a vendor like Revolutionary Security who can come in and assist with recovery efforts. It could be law enforcement, could be FBI, could even be your ISAC in your industries, depending on who you're working with. All of these sources of assistance are going to be helpful if you have an incident. Help you identify, help you come up with remediation plans, provides intelligence overall to the process. Again, as I mentioned, maintaining active membership in industry-specific information sharing and analysis centers, or ISACs. These groups can provide early notification of attacker activity, could be adjacent organizations to your businesses. It could be a supply chain. Manufacturer was hit with ransomware, or a manufacturer was compromised and their software may have embedded malware in it due to that compromise. So staying abreast of the overall cybersecurity picture within your sector is very important.
So Daryl, how did these guys get into this system in the beginning?
Again, it was a compromised system account that was exposed to the internet. So once they were able to obtain those credentials, they had remote access into the system, and then they utilized a third-party remote access solution in order to gain that foothold and establish the persistence. This could be, anything from, even enabling remote desktop externally. It could be installing a client-based tool like TeamViewer or something along those lines, VNC, to gain access. It could even involve a third-party hosted solution like LogMeIn, or even Zoom meetings potentially could be used to establish remote control to the systems.
So it sounds like it's kind of important to check for stuff that might not necessarily indicate a virus, but something that changed that you weren't aware of.
That's absolutely true. Maintaining your configurations, understanding your environment, knowing what normal looks like in your environment, and establishing that baseline. It's very tricky to blacklist traffic and behavior in an environment to identify every possible permutation of an attack or a malicious activity. However, if you're in a lot of teams, very static in what their network footprint looks like, if you can establish your firewall rule sets, your detection capabilities, and monitoring to recognize what normal looks like and alert on anything else, that would be really key in here. And gets into the next point, traffic monitoring and effective firewalling. Do your servers really need to be remotely accessible or have internet access? If not, lock them down. Don't allow them access out. Make sure you understand what ports are listening in your environment, what you're expecting inbound. If remote desktop, for instance, is not needed from the internet in and shouldn't be, there are the remote access solutions that are much more robust. Then make sure that it's disabled. Continually test and monitor your environment. And then the last thing, as we had talked about earlier, offline backups. You have to have backups in place that are not reachable from the network in any way. This could be going back to tape infrastructure is still the most common bulk backup medium for offline backups. Also very, very important to test the backup and recovery process for your backup media. Ensure that you're backing up what you think you're backing up. Ensure that you can actually recover the systems. The last thing you want to do is find out that, hey, we're awesome, we had an offline backup last week, it's not going to take any time to recover from the system, and then find out that the backup was only backing up a single system or is unreadable. That's going to lead to a very bad day for sure. So very important to have those processes nailed down. Okay. Any other questions about the incident that I could answer? Any other chat questions? Ready?
Tom, you got those, or you want me to read them?
Let's see here. The attacker was in there for 35 days, one of the questions, and what can be done to detect and alert the incident sooner?
So again, monitoring your systems, particularly service accounts. If you have a service account that's being used by a software to run a background service, monitor those very closely. Enable very strict controls on passwords for those. Very often those accounts are set up to not have their passwords rotated. You would typically choose a very strong, very long password for service accounts. Limit the accounts, the service accounts, limit the access they have to logging onto other systems. They should definitely be following a least privilege model, only being able to do what they should do. Monitor very closely any remote access that you have allowed. Whether that's access to an FTP server, access to a remote desktop server, monitor that very closely. and definitely alert if anything is out of the ordinary. Again, if you have someone trying to crack a password through remote desktop, for instance, and you see that, say for instance, Tom has, he typically logs in, checks on systems at night, but then all of a sudden during the middle of the day, Tom fails his login 100 times. That's very abnormal behavior and something that you would definitely want to look into a little closer. Also, monitoring your applications that are installed and validating that they're still actively used. For instance, if you notice that Zoom is installed on one of your servers, or Log Me In, or Go to My PC, or any of that type of software, that should raise flags. It's very unlikely that those systems should be utilizing that form of remote access through a third party. So definitely having an understanding of your environment is going to be key to preventing these attacks.
We have yet another question on the offline backups. Question is, please elaborate on offline backups. Or daily backups are made internally and a copy is sent to the cloud offline. So if a virus was buried, doesn't that imply that the offline is bad also? Sorry for the confusion.
No, it definitely could. If your systems are already infected at the time that you're performing your backups, then yes, it's very likely the malware is going to be backed up into the system as well. One of the keys is at that point, it's a pre-infection or pre-execution, hopefully, that backups were made before the malware was actually executed. That should provide you some mechanisms for getting in and disabling that malware now that you know what you're looking for to prevent execution. And also shipping the backup out over the cloud is probably not something that we would consider to be an offline backup from the standpoint that you're accessing those through a network resource. And if someone has a foothold in your environment, they could potentially detect your backup path. Whether you're backing that up to an Amazon cloud, Google Cloud, whichever providers you're using for that, there is going to be a way for them to access that data. So again, be aware of whether your offline backups are truly offline or not.
And another question, in that situation with your client, would a solution like internal network packet analysis be of any use? I know there's some products that look for signatures. How do you feel about those?
Yeah, so typically we see intrusion detection systems being deployed. One of the hazards with intrusion detection is encrypted traffic is sometimes difficult for intrusion detection to see into. And attackers are getting much more knowledgeable about that, and encryption is getting easier and easier for them to implement. It is definitely one of the tools in your toolkit, but heavy reliance on that is probably something that should be used in a holistic picture. You should be looking at system logs, system event logs, configuration management for monitoring changes, more of your symptomatic indicators that a compromise has occurred. The other thing with intrusion detection, a lot of the systems are rolling those into their next-gen firewalls now. So what you end up seeing is someone deploys, a certain vendor's firewall, and it's got intrusion detection capability. That will typically apply only to rule sets that are enabled, that'll have allowed traffic due to performance requirements. It won't give you a good idea of what's being attempted in your system, and also won't give you a good idea of the internal side of what's going on in your system. That's the question about internal traffic packet captures. Yes, again, baselining what's normal. Identify what systems are typically talking to other systems. If you have a Windows server, for instance, that typically talks to a database server, you've got an application installed on there. And that's what normal looks like for that system, other than, your typical Active Directory traffic, things of that nature. All of a sudden, your server is reaching out to workstations, is reaching out to other servers, is reaching out to systems that's not normal. without a doubt, those are the things you want to alert on. Doing full packet captures, those are great. It tends to be very expensive from a storage standpoint if you're going to capture much traffic at all like that. So it's definitely a good tool. It's something that's out of reach for a lot of entities, though.
Got another question where readers want to know more, and specifically about the admin attack. Was that just simply someone being dumb, or was that someone with poor credentials, or how was that compromise detected?
Without getting into specifics of the actual incident, common ways are going to be, yes, easily guessed passwords, temporary passwords. We see a fair amount of time still that applications are set up with default credentials. Since it's a service account, it's often missed to go back and reset those credentials. And if the account is not, again, locked down to prevent the systems that it can attack and talk to, and is limited to only the permissions required to run the application, we tend to see a lot of activity around default accounts like that. So.
And another question from the crowd, kind of recapping, was this remote access done by a product, or was it just native connections? The question really is, would something like E1, Toshibox, MRC Remote Connect server mitigate this, or would there be additional measures recommended?
Yeah, so depending on the solution, those can help mitigate some of the risk. At the end of the day, if you have a service, you've not implemented multi-factor authentication, you're relying on username and password, the actual compromise could occur. Again, strong security hygiene like complex passwords. Password rotation is something that's fallen a little bit out of favor due to the complexity of the passwords, which that's a reasonable trade-off in my opinion. But ensuring that those controls are applied across the board. Some remote access solutions don't use your Active Directory credentials, don't enable two-factor authentication. So users who set that up, particularly if the user wasn't authorized to do so, but they're just trying to, they're trying to work from home. They're trying to be, what they think is a good employee, but they implement something that doesn't enforce your strong passwords. That could always be a risk, regardless of what your security controls might be.
Another technical question here. We've got one from Mac. Are VLANs and ACLs in a layer 3 switch sufficient? That should sort of limit the unauthorized traffic to endpoints and ports, shouldn't it?
Depending on the design, yes, segmentation is key. Going into the OT networks, you look at the Purdue model. Strong segmentation is always critical in limiting the access that can occur between those VLANs. Particularly when you're grouping them much like a DMZ. So your internet traffic, when you're allowing traffic into your mail server, your web server, you would terminate that potentially in a DMZ. And then that DMZ has very limited access to what it can do internally. Maybe your Exchange server can talk to some of your Active Directory servers. Your clients can talk to your Exchange server, things of that nature. What you don't need is that your Exchange server needs to talk to your manufacturing environment. That would likely be a very, very bad design choice, could lead to an overall compromise.
I'm sort of catching a theme here that there's also procedures and enforcement of procedures is a real strong part of cybersecurity.
Yes, absolutely true. Procedures will help make everything clear to your employees, both your technical employees and your non-technical employees. Making sure that security awareness is in place, that people understand that, that through no intention of their own, they could become an inside attacker of sorts. Once an attacker compromises an internal machine, an internal account, they have the same access rights to the user they compromised. So definitely security awareness, response planning, detection processes, requirements put in place for password controls, effective monitoring, firewalling, approval processes, for instance. You know, you may, if you're a large organization, you definitely want to have a different set of resources that are reviewing and approving firewall rules than the resources who are actually enabling those rules, and have a good check and balance in place to go back and validate that the rule that was implemented is the rule that was intended.
That's a good example of where quick is probably not the first thing you should do. You should probably think it through and have peer review, because I know a lot of code reviews, the same sort of concept applies.
Yes, absolutely.
One last question here. Do you think MFA or multi-factor authentication negates the need for strong, difficult to remember password that always gets written down because of its complexity?
No, in my opinion, it's not. It's again, it's another tool in the toolkit. If you require multi-factor authentication in front of your internal authentication, for instance, that would protect your internal credentials from being brute forced. Because if they can't get past the multi-factor authentication, then they can't even begin to crack your passwords. However, once they get into an environment through whatever method, it could be a drive-by, you know, a phishing email. If you don't have strong credentials within your environment and good controls and monitoring within your perimeter, then you get into a scenario where the attacker can pivot and spread against multiple systems very quickly and typically without detection.
Another question here. Do you cringe when you hear small companies depending on IT outsourcing? It sort of implies there's a dependency on this entity to remotely access your system. On any quick thoughts on how to filter out Acme IT support companies?
That can be a tricky question because it really depends. Small organizations sometimes don't have the resources to hire appropriately skilled staff to manage the IT functions, and particularly the cybersecurity functions. So when I worked in the industry, I probably had a little different perspective on that. I probably would have been more in the cringe crowd on that. Working with a variety of companies and seeing how they function, though, outsourcing IT can actually better enable them to be proactive in their IT and cybersecurity functions. So no, I don't cringe when I hear that at this point. There are certain methods that work better than others with outsourcing. Just like most things, a lot of it's all in the execution.
So I'm assuming if you've got good procedures in place, the same sort of checks and balances would apply, and might not actually, as you indicated, be a bad idea to have outsourcing. It's better than no support or no planning.
Yes, you definitely need to have good methods for monitoring and you know, use the bad word here, auditing the functions to make sure that when you put your service level agreements or your processes in front of your support vendors or even your support staff, you need to have good way to go and validate that process and that activity is actually occurring. And if you have all of that documented when you provide it to your service provider, then it really, you know, identifies to them what the expectations are. And the better your process is in place, the fewer arguments you're going to have about who's at fault when things aren't being done right. Or I should say fewer valid arguments. You may not have less arguments, but.
Another question, how do you go about old operating systems due to pre-existing hardware that's required to support it? Keep the support requirement for the hardware, but protect these assets needed to support it?
Yeah, so really treating these older operating systems that can't be updated anymore is very similar to protections of your embedded devices, your PLCs, your RTUs, relays, depending on your environment. You really have to rely on inline and passive monitoring techniques rather than active agent-based installs on those systems. Typically, the older systems don't have the resources. I mean, modern anti-malware packages or event detection response packages are very resource intensive. They're monitoring a lot of things, and those systems are likely not going to be able to perform well enough to allow the access that the prevention software needs to the system while still being able to meet their timely response that they need on the system. So you would be looking at more technologies like logging and monitoring, which can be enabled on the system through a variety of methods: syslog, local logs, SNMP, things of that nature. You'd be looking at intrusion detection sensors that don't exist on the system but exist on the segment that can watch that traffic. And much more difficult to be proactive on some of those systems. But again, cutting down that dwell time, once you start to see anomalous behavior, being able to isolate those systems and investigate is going to be key.
We did get another question, right? As I was about to say, we're done with questions. Does using virtual machines mitigate the risk because of the hardware on the old OS?
Virtual machines don't necessarily mitigate network-based attacks. In some cases, your hardware itself can be compromised through firmware issues or particular network cards or I/O modules have been known to have problems with parsing protocols inappropriately that could allow an attacker to potentially knock a system offline, or in some cases, if you guys studied the Ukraine attack at all, replacing firmware on systems could either change the function of the system or in itself brick the system to prevent access to it. Virtualizing that does help mitigate some of those risks. It gives you, in some instances, a choke point to monitor your systems a little closer. If you can monitor everything in and out of your virtual machines, for instance, at the host level, that'll give you a lot better chance of catching things that may not have monitoring capabilities in and of themselves. And depending on your virtualization platform, you may have some micro-segmentation possibilities within the environment to where you can control outside of the actual machine itself what traffic is allowed. Kind of like putting a firewall in front of every host, for instance, that's not controlled by the host, the virtual machine itself. So there are definitely some gains that you can make in virtualization. Just like we had talked about before, a lot of it comes down to execution and understanding the environment. Microsegmentation in platforms can be tricky to install right. So you definitely want to consider investing in the expert level of resources for your virtualization platform, whether it's through hiring or outsourcing. You would definitely want to be very careful about the instance and just perform due diligence and test as you go.